I always say that Reformed Baptists love Presbyterians, often more than Presbyterians love their Reformed Baptists. And Presbyterians tend to love Lutherans more than Lutherans love them back. So
Yes.
you had something to add to that, and I think it'd be a fun way to close out.
Oh yeah. No, I've had people say this before, and I say Lutherans do this with Rome all the time. Right? We do this with Roman Catholics. We want for whatever reason we're like we want you to consider our holy orders valid or something. So we want to be recognized by Rome. And then I said Rome really wants to be recognized by the East, and the East just doesn't care and hates everybody.
That's my
so
Baptists love Presbyterians, Presbyterians love Lutherans, Lutherans love Catholics, Catholics love Eastern Orthodox, and Eastern Orthodox hate everyone.
Sometimes I feel the weight of the world fall down on me so heavy, and I need a friendly voice with some good theology. Calvinistically speaking, so I mix a manly drink, Pepsi and shoe polish, and I hit the YouTube link. Don't say hit, that sounds violent. And I feel my troubles all melt away. It's your Calvinist Podcast with Keith Foskey. Beards and bow ties, laughs till sunrise. It's your Calvinist Podcast with Keith Foskey. He's not like most Calvinists, he's nice.
Welcome back to Your Calvinist Podcast. My name is Keith Foskey, and I am your Calvinist. And you can tell by the way I'm dressed today, which is not normal for a podcast, that today is another one of my patent-pending bow tie dialogues, which means I've gone out and I have found someone from another perspective within Christianity. I've invited them into the show, and today we're going to talk about what some of our differences might be, and maybe some of the areas where we could come together and agree. And I do this for all kinds of different denominations, and I've talked to people from all different backgrounds, but I've rarely been more excited than I am today, because the young man that I have coming on the show with me is someone that I truly respect and have learned a lot from. And I say that not to flatter him in any way, but genuinely, Dr. Jordan B. Cooper is a scholar. He is a Lutheran, which means as a Reformed person, I'm bound to love him because that's part of the deal. Reformed people love Lutherans. And so, Dr. Jordan Cooper, I want to thank you for coming on to Bowtie Dialogues with me today.
Well, thanks so much. It's good to be here. I only wish I realized that I should have been wearing a bow tie today. But
well, it's okay.
I'm not dressed properly here.
No, it's fine. It's fine. Bow tie dialogues is sort of like I wear the bow tie because it one of the things that my denominational videos, which I think you're familiar with, I do these little skits, and the Presbyterian wears the bow tie. So it's like I'm interviewing you sort of as from that perspective. Like I'm the Presbyterian, I'm the superior theology guy, and I'm inviting people in so I can talk to them. But the funny thing is, I'm not even Presbyterian. I'm a Baptist, but that's sort of the idea. Is I'm the guy in the bow tie. So it's no problem that you don't have one on. But I do have to mention, for anybody who doesn't know Dr. Cooper, and he has a huge YouTube presence. He's obviously well known by many of you, but for those who don't, I do want to give you a quick bio for him. Dr. Jordan Cooper is an ordained Lutheran pastor and the executive director of Just and Sinner. He is a fellow of systematic theology at the Widener Institute and the chair of Lutheran dogmatics at the American Lutheran Theological Seminary. He also serves as campus minister in residence with Lutheran Student Fellowship at Cornell University and is a regular speaker at a variety of other campus groups at the university. I wasn't aware of your work at Cornell. That's really interesting. Do you tend to enjoy that, working with the students there?
Yeah. I've been doing campus ministry here at Cornell, which is now coming to an end because I'm moving this summer. But I've been doing it for about 7 years now. So it's been really wonderful. I love college students. College ministry is really my passion. And I think that as soon as I started ministry, my first call, it just was college age students and those who were in college, even those who weren't in college, but around that age group. tended to have the best conversations. And I think some of that is just students at that age are so curious, about the world. And they are so, they're looking for questions, for answers to questions, and asking a lot of questions. And I think people later in life, they're kind of settled into their lives and they're settled into their jobs and their families, but they're just not asking in the same way. So it always is a great opportunity to kind of do these theological deep dives when you're engaged in campus ministry. So yeah, campus ministry as a whole is something I've done for a long time. At Cornell, I've worked with a few different organizations. I'm going to be involved at Yale to some degree after my move. And I don't know exactly what that's going to look like after this summer.
Well, that's amazing.
Yeah.
And one question about that, in your work with young people you said the last 7 years there at Cornell,
Yeah.
what would you say is the biggest maybe shift in conversation? Because you've gone through, I guess if you've been there that long, you went through COVID, you've been through, sort of the AI revolution, which is happening now. Maybe what's one thing that you've seen that's maybe questions you're getting now that you weren't getting 7 years ago? Is there something you can think of?
It's really weird how different campus ministry is now than it was 7 years ago, 10 years ago. COVID really changed so much. I mean, the cultural conversation has shifted to such significant degrees at this point that I feel like college ministry is almost unrecognizable, compared to what it was when I initially got here. There are a number of things that have changed. So I'll try to be brief and maybe give you just a couple. One is the loneliness of young men has become a much more obvious issue since that time, since the pre-COVID era. And of course was an issue at the time too, but I think it was really exacerbated by that. So there are a lot more young men that I have encountered in ministry who are fleeing from progressivism, and I think are in danger of jumping into very unhealthy movements because of that, as a kind of reaction against the issues they perceive in society. So that's been a very different shift, because I think that ministry very much went in the other way. It was like everybody was trending towards kind of the left in many ways in campus ministry, and I've seen that change ideologically, bear itself out significantly. So that's certainly an element of it. But the weirdest thing to me is, and this has been more clear this year, I think, than it has been in other years, is the way that COVID has really affected socialization. And this group of college students now, I mean, they went through high school during the COVID years. And when you are not able to socialize in person during those kind of primary socialization years, where you develop your own personality and develop your concept of kind of what it means to be a human being that's not just tied to your parents, and like you need in-person community to really be able to do that. So a lot of their self-perception is driven by online communication. And so I would say the biggest change that I've seen, even in the last 3 years, is going from a place where I talk to students about the dangers of addictions to technology, which is a problem that we all face, right? Myself included. And
Sure.
they all know it's a problem. Like we all know that this is not good. Our relationship to technology is unhealthy. To a point now where I've spoken at events on campus about these issues, and students don't even see it as a problem. This is just how life is. They don't need friendships in person. They don't need to relate to people in real life because they have the internet. I mean, I've had multiple conversations with students, and I don't know, maybe one of them will be watching here now, but I've had multiple conversations with students who recognize me from YouTube. And they're like, "Oh, you're that Lutheran guy on YouTube, right?" And they talk to me and have a great conversation. And then I invite them to my Bible study, and they're like, "Nah, I don't know, I'm pretty busy." So it's really strange, because I'm like, these people will sit and watch my videos for hours, but they won't come to an in-person Bible study. So it's a weird disconnect. And I think that they're seeing that, they're feeling like, well, the needs are kind of being met through the internet, so we don't really need that in our in-person communities.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a lot to think about. I really hadn't thought about how the socialization has changed, but you're right. I mean, so many people are willing to have these relationships almost completely digital, where we never touch,
Yep.
we never physically touch each other or, shake hands or anything. And I mean, and I would even say I have people that I would now call friends that I've never met in real life,
Sure.
but I talk to them more than I talk to people that are in my real life sometimes. And that's certainly a strange advent of modern culture, something that's only recently come.
Yeah.
For sure. Well, I want to again thank you for coming on, and especially since I am apparently the one person who was able to make your very short list of enemies. And so, for anybody who doesn't know about this picture went out last week. Everyone was posting their enemies lists because of an unfortunate picture that went out online. And so you posted your enemies list, and for anybody who didn't see it, this is the list, and it's 6 times with one name, and that name is Keith Foskey. So I just said, I sent you a message. I said, well, I don't know what I did to make the list, but at least now maybe you'll come on my show. So tell me why I made the list.
Well, the reality is my plan was to put Remy Shepard's name on there, who's Lutheran Answers. But then I realized that he wouldn't know the drama going on in Presbyterianism. And so I was like, I wonder if I could think of a Calvinist that has a sense of humor whose name I could stick on there. So you came to mind.
Well, I'm glad I did, because it led to this conversation, which I don't know if you remember this or not, but about a year ago, I reached out to you and we were going to do something, and it just kind of we got disconnected and I wasn't able to get back with you. But I've wanted to have you on the show for a long time, simply because I do watch your videos and I do get a lot out of them. And even in areas where we disagree, I find myself learning from you. And so I wanted to introduce my audience to you. I think this is a good thing. Hey guys, I just want to take a second to remind you that this show is a ministry of Sovereign Grace Family Church. So if you're in the Jacksonville, Florida area and you're looking for a church, look us up at sgfcjax.org. Also, I want to mention our 2 channel sponsors. First is Squirrely Joe's Coffee. It's the best coffee in the world, and it can be shipped directly to your home. And if you go to squirrelyjoes.com/YourCalvinist, you'll get a free bag. Also, I want to mention Dominion Wealth Strategists. I'm going to have a commercial for them later in the program, so be sure to watch to the end to see how they can serve you. Yeah, no, I'm very grateful. In fact, I want to give you my one of the ones that was very helpful to me. About a year and a half ago, I was giving a lecture at a conference, lecture, sermon, whatever. It was more of a lecture, not so much a sermon, but it was on it was called The Calvinism of Luther. And I used that title to sort of as a clickbaity way to get people's attention, because obviously Luther is older than Calvin, was there first. Sure. But the idea was they both had a similar anthropology because both of them were coming from an Augustinian perspective. And so I watched your video where you dealt with Leighton Flowers and his anti-Augustinian view. And you said, this guy sounds like a Pelagian. and yeah. I'm friends with Leighton, and I know he hates that. In fact, he's going to be on my show next week, and at least that's the plan. And I like the fact that at least you were recognizing some of the same things some of us do. And that is, even though he doesn't want the title, there seems to be a Pelagian bent in this movement. And I don't know how much you know about Provisionism and what Leighton has begun or those things. I don't know how deep of a dive you've done with that.
Yeah, I've done some. I mean, it was a while ago that I had looked into a lot of this, just because a lot of people were talking about Provisionism. And I haven't watched, I've met Leighton in person. We met at ETS a few years ago. Very nice man and everything.
He's a good friend. Even for our disagreements, he's a good man.
Yeah, for sure. But so since that time, I kind of knew Provisionism from him and watching some of his videos that I had watched. And from what I've seen from Provisionists who comment, at least on my videos pretty regularly, some of them, and you can tell me if he's doing the same thing, but some of them seem to have pretty openly embraced the label of Pelagian, or at least the responses that I now often see are, you're just believing lies about the history about Pelagius. So it seems to me that there's kind of an embrace of Pelagius rather than any attempt to differentiate their views from Pelagius. But I don't. That's what little I've seen. So I could be totally off base there.
No, I think you're 100% right, because Leighton has, in fact, he was on my show last year, and he endorses a book by, I think, a woman author who wrote the book. I don't remember her name, but basically arguing that what we understand as Pelagianism is not what Pelagius believed or taught, and therefore we're misrepresenting Pelagianism. We're misrepresenting Pelagius by ascribing the teachings of Pelagianism to him. And so he really didn't believe the things that historically have been ascribed to him about the will and things like that. And yet I hear that, but when I go back and I listen to what they're saying, the very things they're saying are the things Pelagius was accused of believing, that one can believe apart from a miraculous change of heart, a work of grace in the heart, things like that, which was basically what Pelagius believed, that a person can on his own, apart from any work of the Spirit, believe the gospel. And obviously Augustine's statement, God command what you will and give us the ability to do what you command, was what kicked off that disagreement, or at least historically what seems to have kicked off the disagreement. So yeah, it's certainly and later when we talk about maybe some of our differences, I want to dig in a little more to Lutheran understanding of Monergism versus a Reformed understanding, because you have a Reformed background. If I'm correct, right?
Yes, I do. Yeah, I was my mother actually converted through 10th Presbyterian Church while James Boyce was there in Philadelphia.
Oh, wow.
And then was baptized in a Presbyterian church. The church I was in when I was younger was not Presbyterian. We were in Massachusetts and there wasn't one nearby, but my parents helped to found an EPC church plant in Massachusetts. And then I went to Presbyterian College at Geneva. So I've had a lot of kind of Reformed formation of my own sense of theology and spirituality, for sure.
Do Lutherans receive Presbyterian baptism? Is there ever a time where there would be a requirement for receiving another baptism, or do they?
No, not at all. I mean, it's pretty universal among all church, except the Eastern Orthodox maybe, but who knows there. That pretty much any Trinitarian baptism is going to be accepted, right? As long as the only exception to that would be like the Mormon baptism, because, and the reason for that would be that we see that though the words Father, Son, and Spirit are used, which are kind of the operative words in baptism, they are used to identify very different subjects than the Triune God. So that's the only time where we have something like a Trinitarian baptism, which we would count as invalid.
What about, and again, I know I'm not sticking to my script. I have a lot of questions on my script, but I just love to talk and ask these questions. What about someone from, say, the Church of Christ? Would you see their view of baptism as being something that would be in conflict with what you guys teach? Or would you, if someone came from the Church of Christ, wanted to join a Lutheran church, would there be any issue there?
What do you think the issue would be? I mean, I know they hold to a kind of baptismal regeneration, but for adults. And I have a lot of Church of Christ types who watch my videos. So who at least say that they basically agree with what I'm saying, other than the, applying this to infants.
Well, that's why I was wondering, because in fact, most of the ones that I have spoken to actually don't like the term baptismal regeneration. They prefer a baptism of remission or baptism for remission of sins. So it's at that point, it's sort of a nuanced view, but they still believe baptism is functional in causing a person to receive forgiveness, right? You're not forgiven until you go into the water and you come out of the water forgiven. And so I know that in Baptist churches, we tend to have difficulty with infant baptism, obviously, because we have a different belief. But even among Churches of Christ, because of what we believe is happening, where, for instance, in the 1689 confession, it says baptism is a sign of our union with Christ, of our forgiveness, of those things. Sure. But it's not sacramentally causal of that. It's simply a sign of that reality.
But the 1689 doesn't it uses at least kind of means of grace language, doesn't it? I mean, there's something a little bit more operative in the language from what I recall.
but and this is again another where sort of we would have to maybe what we mean and what are terms. Certainly the 1689 references means of grace, terms like that. But as far as regarding baptism, it calls baptism a sign of these things. But this is where we come back to what does the sign confer? How do we understand it in regard to its effectiveness? And this is a debate, even like I know I have PCA brethren who would say they deny baptismal regeneration, but then there are others who would say they affirm baptismal efficacy. Well, what does that mean? What's affecting? And I know that's again just a big part of the conversation of where people come to differences. But within the churches of Christ, they definitely believe that you have to be baptized. You have to be baptized as a believer, and you have to be baptized for the remission of sins. If you're baptized for any other reasons, for instance, if you're baptized in a Baptist church and then you go to a Church of Christ, they will make you be baptized again because you weren't baptized for the correct reason. You weren't you weren't correctly baptized because you didn't do it for the right reason.
Yeah. So we wouldn't. I mean, we basically would accept pretty much any Trinitarian baptism. We don't really discriminate on modes. So even when it comes to modes of immersion versus sprinkling versus pouring, we accept all of them as valid modes of baptism. So we don't make the efficacy of baptism dependent upon what it is that you believe is happening in baptism. And the reason for that is because the efficacy of baptism is dependent upon the element and the word of God. So the difference with the Mormon baptism would be that the understanding of, again, those identifiers, Father, Son, and Spirit would be distinct. So that's where the issue would be. So if those identifiers are different, right, then that would, or they reference something different. Obviously, Jesus didn't, speak in English. He didn't give us those exact words, right? Words are, we use words with particular reference. So if the referent is distinct, that's what would make a baptism invalid. But in terms of what you believe is actually happening spiritually in the baptism, it's not. The validity of baptism isn't dependent on that.
Gotcha. And so, and this again, just diving in a little deeper, we have those who would deny Trinitarian language and would baptize in the name of Jesus only, such as like a Oneness Pentecostal group. That would be rejected.
Yeah, we would rebaptize at that point. Yeah, I would say, sure, you've got in the book of Acts, they're baptized in the name of Jesus. I don't think that's a baptismal formula. I think that's a summary. But at that point, if there's a question, right? If we look at this and say, I'm not quite sure if that fits the criteria, you do it, right? So if there's a question of something like that, err on the side of baptizing, again, to make sure they have a valid baptism, and then ask God to forgive you if you're wrong about it. I don't know.
I understand.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I enjoy doing on Bowtie Dialogues is simply asking what are the main theological distinctions of any group. And like I said, I've had folks on from the Church of Christ. I've had folks on from, I've even had other Lutherans. Hans Feeney, I'm sure, of Lutheran Satire. He's been on. I had him on with several other brothers. We had like a gang of Lutherans ganged up on me.
Nice.
It was rough. It was rough stuff. I felt like I was like the greasers and the socias back in the day. I don't know if you remember that movie, The Outsiders, right? Like I felt like I was in the middle of a gang war and I was all by myself. I was pony boy there, all by myself. So, but with that, I always like to ask this question because I tend to find it even though there's some overlap, every theologian, every pastor tends to answer this question a little bit differently. And that is, if I were to ask you, what are the main things that distinguish what you believe as a Lutheran from other Protestant denominations, what would be maybe the top three things that you would say, this is what it means for me to be a Lutheran, and this is what I think is distinguishable from, whether it's Baptists, Presbyterians, Anglicans, or what have you?
Yeah, sure. So the first I would say is this idea of conservative reform. And this term comes from Charles Porterfield Krauth in his book, The Conservative Reformation and Its Theology, which is my go-to recommendation for people if they want to really understand the Lutheran Reformation in depth. It's a pretty big book, but extremely helpful. And what Krauth does in that book is he distinguishes between these different approaches to the continuity of the church. And there is one that is just kind of a traditionalism, which would be Rome. Now, I don't even know if you could really say that about post-Vatican II Rome, but at least, you're talking 19th century Rome, it's kind of a different beast. Then you have your kind of radical reformers that are kind of all reform, no conservation. And then you have, of course, the Calvinists who are a little bit more on the reform side, less on the conservation side, whereas the Lutherans and Anglicans, this maybe wouldn't be distinct about Lutherans because Anglicans would fit there as well. But that is this conception that we both need to conserve our traditions, but also reform from within. And so what this means is that Lutherans had these general principles of retaining what had been passed down and what had been received in tradition. So that shows itself in forms of worship, for example. Our worship, of course, is really just a development of what was the medieval Mass, purged of the theological issues that we perceived in the medieval Mass. So we look a lot more traditional. So the way that we tend to view tradition is we give a kind of higher authority, I think, to tradition than the Reforms generally do. So that's one element. The second would be our view of the means of grace. I mean, the perception of God always working through the means of grace, through word and sacrament, is really key to understanding everything about Lutheran theology. In some way, everything that we think or say about God or about us in relation to God flows through that and is viewed kind of through that lens. So that would be distinct. And then the third thing I would say is probably our confessionalism, in that Lutherans are very, of course, you have different branches of Lutherans, so it's not like there are Lutherans who aren't as strongly confessional, of course, but more than like the Reformed traditions, Lutherans don't have we have continuity in our confessions. Like we haven't gone back and changed our confessions over time. And we have one set of confessional standards that have been pretty rigorously adhered to and passed down and taught over the ages. So I think there's something distinct about the way that we approach confessionalism as opposed to some other Protestant groups.
That's great. That was very, very helpful. I love that. I wrote it down as you were talking, the idea of all reform and no conservation, the idea of a conservative reformation. That's helpful, just thinking historically, because obviously Rome got many things wrong, but not everything, right? So
right.
There are things worth conserving. I think there is a natural tendency, especially among my Baptist brethrens, to throw everything out if it even smells Catholic, right? I mean,
Yes.
We've in our church worked toward reintroducing things into the liturgy that were not part for so long, because again, they felt Catholic. Things like reading the creeds or things like that, which having responsive readings and reading out our confessions publicly. These things just felt different. They felt like that just it smells Catholic again. So conserving the good things is that's helpful. That's
and I think there's
certainly
really an understanding when we look at like the early church that's us. We have this understanding that we are that same church. Not to say that Lutherans are exclusively that church. We don't make claims of some kind of ecclesial exclusivity or something, but like I was just reading, for example, Johann Gerhard, his volume on the church or the ministry. I don't know. I forget which one it was because I was reading both of them recently. But the way that he goes back to a lot of councils in the ancient church and looks at the canons in the councils. And I was kind of struck reading him by how seriously he took the canons. And I'm not just talking about the doctrine that was declared at the councils, like discipline and structural things. And he was speaking as if, well, this is our church. This is what we did then. And it kind of struck me reading that, and I've recognized this plenty of times, but that I often think we don't think that way. And I think it's unfortunate that Protestants don't tend to think that way, because it's as if we're giving the history of the church to Rome and say, well, that was always you. And then we started here. But I think the reality is the church heritage is also ours. I don't think we should. I don't think we can honestly give those things to Rome, but I don't think we should give those things to Rome either.
Yeah, that's honestly not only a powerful thought, but kind of a beautiful thought, that we're part of a heritage that we don't have to give up. just because we don't agree with the things that have the errors that accumulated over time.
Right.
Gavin Ortland talks about the accretions. I like that. I like that
Yeah,
word
right.
that he uses. Those things that accumulated over time, and certainly we would deny many of those things and those teachings, but there are still valuable things that need to be rediscovered and
Right.
and appreciated. And that leads me to the next question. And this is, I brought up Gavin for two reasons. One, to mention that word, but also because in my conversation with him, we talked about the doctrine of sola fide. And I want to address this with you on two levels.
Okay.
One, I want to ask you where you see sola fide in regard to the concept of theological triage. And I'm not even sure you're familiar with that term, so if you need, I can explain it. But basically, just means things that are priorities for the gospel and things that are secondary, right? Things that are like when you do triage, if you something that has to keep you alive versus something that's maybe a secondary matter. I've always put sola fide as a primary doctrine. Like if you deny this, you're adding works to the gospel. But I understand that's I even disagreed somewhat with Gavin when we talked about that. And I kind of, as a Lutheran, obviously somebody who I would have assumed would affirm sola fide, where do you put it in that scope of essential versus non-essential doctrine?
Yeah, well, I mean, Martin Luther calls it the chief article, and
that's what I said. I said the same thing, but yeah, okay.
Yeah, so it's pretty central, and a lot of our theologians have also referred to it as the chief article as well. With that being said, you have to kind of ask a number of questions related to that. One, is the doctrine of justification still retained to a certain significant degree, though marred by certain theological traditions? And at what point does a departure from the principles of sola fide mean an outright denial of the biblical doctrine of justification? And I don't think that is always maybe as clear as we may want it to be. So I think when Luther identifies this, the doctrine of justification as the chief article, or the doctrine upon which the church stands or falls, he famously says this. He's talking about a doctrine, as in one particular dogma related to justification, but I also think he's talking about something a little broader than that, and that is the mode of speech that defines the church. Right? So the church is defined by its proclamation of Christ for you. So that justification is the lens through which we view other teachings. So as we're looking at any teaching, like the incarnation, right? Well, why are we talking about the incarnation? Is the incarnation just about making sure that we have all of our metaphysical categories straight? Well, not really. I mean, that's part of what we're doing, but what's the point? Well, the point is that if we don't get our Christology right, we miss what it means that Christ is really for us and has really redeemed us. So this is why that non-assumptus principle is so central to the Cappadocian Fathers, this principle that says that which was not assumed could not be redeemed. This is why the church rejected things like Apollinarianism, which denied even just one element of Christ's humanity, because if Christ didn't assume all of what human nature is, then all of human nature can't be redeemed. So I think when you're talking justification, we're speaking about Christ for you in redemption in a broader sense too, than just the particular one element of the Ordo Salutis that is justification. So I think we have to keep that in mind when we're talking about our theology. So when I would look at something like, say, whether it's the modern Roman tradition or the Eastern Orthodox tradition, I think there are elements of that are still retained in those churches. I think that they are retained imperfectly and impurely. But as a Lutheran, I mean, no offense, but I'd say the same thing about Calvinism. So Lutherans have historically said that about Calvinism too. And it's not because we don't think Calvinists are Christians. It's because we have this idea, what's called the Felicitous inconsistency, where we say that what the theology that one has in their head is not always consistent with the piety of the heart. And there can be this kind of disconnect, and it's a good thing that there's a disconnect. So the question is, when you're looking at somebody who, say, denies sola fide in a formal sense, what is it that they're looking to on their deathbed? Right? What is it that they're looking to say like where my hope is? And even if someone formally does not teach, say, the doctrine of sola fide, if the answer to that question is that their hope is in Christ and his vicarious atonement, or whatever atonement model you want to stick in there too, but if your hope is in Christ's person and work, I mean, that's the essence of what sola fide is really about. And so I think that Christians tend to be better in their prayers on this than they are often in their formulations theologically. So in other words, what I'm saying is I don't exclude, say, the Roman Catholics or Eastern Orthodox from saving faith or something.
Sure. I'm very curious, because you said you felt like there was an inconsistency on sola fide from the Reformed side, and I tend to feel a similar situation with Lutheran. So I think this might be a fun back and forth for us, maybe to say, where do we see an inconsistency here? So because you're the guest, I'm happy to go first and let you go second. But it would seem to me that the doctrine of baptismal regeneration, which is very strongly held in Lutheran theology, would at least push against the idea of the doctrine of sola fide. If we are justified by faith alone in the work of Christ, and yet there's this action that must be done either to us or by through the church is done for us, which is baptism. How are we not then applying this work, this action being done, to the addition to or cause of our justification, and therefore it's not only by faith?
Yeah, sure. So what this points out, I think, is the reason why I say I don't think that Calvinists and Lutherans approach sola fide in exactly the same way. And that is because of our sacramental theology. So there's a really helpful article on this by Philip Carey, he's Anglican, he's not Lutheran, but he has this article, Why Luther is Not Quite Protestant, which I think outlines this very, very well. And Luther's doctrine of justification in many ways flows out of his doctrine of baptism, which is what I think a lot of people miss when they're reading Luther, because Luther affirmed what was the medieval teaching about baptism, that baptism is this gift of God. It affects grace, it regenerates, it remits sin. Though, of course, in the medieval period, they're talking really about just remitting the consequences of original sin, which kind of leads you then to all sorts of other things in the sacramental life of the church. But as Luther started to really grapple with the question of his own guilt and grapple with Scripture, one of the things he was wrestling with was this biblical theme of promise, right? So when someone trusts in God for their justification, say, look at Abraham, because Abraham's the example that Paul uses, Romans 3 and 4. Abraham's trust in God's promise is not abstract. It's not just in his head, but it's in something concrete given to him. So we have the covenant ratification ceremony, right? Genesis chapter 15, where you have the cutting of the animals and God passes through. Abraham's asleep. He's totally passive during this thing. But God actually had a concrete way that he delivered his grace and his promise to Abraham, which was through that covenant ratification ceremony, kind of like a sacrament of that time. And God has always attached his promises to certain rites, what we would call sacraments. And so when we're talking about sola fide, we're speaking about faith in Christ, but also not just Christ in the abstract, but Christ in the places where he has promised and given himself to us. So when we're talking about the relationship between baptism, say, and justification, and faith and justification, we're really talking about two different things. Because when we're talking about baptism, we're saying, what is the means by which God's grace and promise is delivered to me? When we're talking about faith, we're saying, what is it in my disposition that receives those benefits that God has delivered to me objectively through the sacraments? So they're talking about two kind of different things. Does that I don't know if that clarifies at all.
No, I think that's very helpful. That illustration is good too. What you just made. So you would say that that's the biggest difference then between in regard to this. I know there's many other differences.
Yeah,
Election,
I think
predestination,
with justification, because when we speak about justification, we don't tend to talk about justification also as just a one-time reality. We speak about justification as the giving of the promise, and the promise is that Christ's righteousness is given to us. So the promise of the forgiveness of sins. And the forgiveness of sins, we would say, are delivered through means. So God delivers the forgiveness of sins through baptism. He delivers the forgiveness of sins through his word. He also delivers it through the sacrament of the altar. And this is Christ's body given for you for the forgiveness of sins. So every time we receive forgiveness, we are being justified. Now, when I say being justified, I don't mean being as in a process, but there is another event which is my justification. So even if you look at, say, the life of Abraham, God reiterates his promise to Abraham multiple times. Right? He does in Genesis 12, Genesis 15, Genesis 17. He gives the promise over and over again. And this is why when Jesus gives us the model prayer, we pray for the forgiveness of our trespasses. We don't just say, thank you that I was forgiven at my justification in the past. So Scripture can certainly at times speak about justification as a past event, Romans 5:1 being an example of this. Right? We have been justified by faith. We have peace with God now. But if you look at the examples that Paul cites in Romans 4 of justification, the two examples he cites in the Old Testament to prove his point are Abraham, Genesis 15. Abraham already had faith in Genesis 12. We know that because Hebrews 11 commends Abraham's faith, right? So what does it mean that he's justified in Genesis 15? Wasn't he already justified in before that? It seems kind of odd. Then he cites Psalm 32. Well, we also know that David trusted God from when he was at his mother's breast, as he said elsewhere. So, and this is an element of his adult life, confessing sin. So what we would say is that justification is a forensic declaration. It's a forensic declaration that your sins are forgiven. We've got these two elements, the negative, there's a non-imputation of sins, a positive imputation of Christ's righteousness. But that delivering of that verdict of justification is one that isn't just a past event, though it is a past event, but it's also a present reality. And it's given to us in different ways throughout our life. So that probably would be a pretty distinct difference from the way that the Reformed tend to speak about justification. Now, I've talked to people who tell me that many of the Reformed scholastics speak in that way too, but I'm not really familiar with that. But certainly in common parlance, I don't hear that too much.
Yeah, I think and you just mentioned it, the forensic declaration tends to be something we look at it as a once for all declaration, rather than something that needs to be repeated. And this kind of comes back to the even the conversation of what happens at the table.
Yeah.
When we think of Roman Catholic Mass and the participation in the Mass, there is this idea of Christ coming down, being offered again as the eternal sacrifice for sins. We read about this in Roman Catholic writing. Is that how a Lutheran would understand what's happening on the table? I understand there's a difference between transubstantiation and sacramental presence.
Right.
I understand you don't like the term consubstantiation, so I won't use it except for to.
Thank you.
Yeah, but you believe in real presence in the elements. I think you would, and forgive me if I'm incorrect, but I would say that you would say there's a sacramental presence. It's real, but it's not something that you would try to tie into Aristotelian understanding of substance and accidents, things like that. So you would deny transubstantiation, but yet agree that Christ is physically present in the bread and the cup. Is that because you believe that the sacrifice is being represented? That's I think maybe a way you can help me understand that.
Yeah, sure. So it all depends on what you mean by represented. And Roman Catholic theologians are not all agreed on what that means. So, and if you read a lot of Ron or Roman ecumenical dialogues, when Rome describes their view of representation, it's not always identical with what was the late medieval view. The major issue that Lutherans have with the Mass, at least perceptions of the Mass that certainly were prominent in the late medieval period, are with the directionality of the Mass. And so Luther makes this distinction in his writings on this issue between a sacrament and a sacrifice. Now, of course, there's a sense in which we can talk about a Eucharistic sacrifice, and Melanchthon uses this language in the Apology of the Augsburg Confession, for example. But when he's talking about the Eucharistic sacrifice, it's we present ourselves as a thank offering to God, Romans 12 kind of stuff, right? So,
Okay.
so there is a sense of sacrifice that is a sacrifice of praise. But that's not just in the Lord's Supper. That's the whole service, and the whole life of the Christian really should be one of Eucharistic sacrifice, of thanksgiving offering because of the great benefits that God has given to us. But in terms of the Eucharist, we would say in the Lord's Supper, so not just because Eucharist, I'm using it in a broader sense before, but specifically the Lord's Supper, Sacrament of the Altar, Holy Communion, whatever term you want to use. We use all of them. So Luther says that the medieval perception is of a sacrifice where the priest is offering an unbloody sacrifice to appease the Father's wrath on behalf of the people. And what Luther says is you're getting the directionality wrong. Because in this view, you're saying that the priest is doing something for the people and giving something to God. And he says, no, instead, a sacrament is God giving something to us. So the priest or the pastor is simply the one who is the instrument of God giving to the congregation. And so we certainly wouldn't use the language of an unbloody sacrifice. We're not talking about the pastor, priest offering anything whatsoever. Instead, God offers the gift of Christ's body and blood to us on the altar. So we do receive forgiveness, we would say, through that gift, but that forgiveness is not received by anything that the priest is doing, but by God coming down and condescending to us. We don't use really the language of representation because we're not going to say that there's any kind of and Rome doesn't use the language of re-sacrifice, but at least at one time, it certainly was a popular understanding in the medieval period that was the case. But we would say that, Christ's atonement was obviously, it was a past reality, happened, roughly 2,000 years ago. But that past reality has to be brought to us. Like there's something that connects us to that event in the past. And so what is it, right? How is it that benefit of Christ, what he did then, actually comes to me individually, personally? That's where we would say the means of grace serve as basically instruments of delivering the benefits of Christ in the present. And so we could say in some way that, yes, when I receive the body and blood of Christ, his sacrifice is made present to me in some way. So if you want to say representation, maybe in that sense, I mean, it's maybe kind of similar, but that's about as far as we're going to go there.
Lutherans hold to real presence, sacramental presence. Calvinists tend to hold to a spiritual presence. And I understand part of the distinction there being the understanding that Calvin had of the corporeal body of Christ, that it's at the right hand of the Father, therefore it's not universal. And I would, and I don't know if I know you probably don't know me very well, but I would, even though I'm a Calvinist, I hold more of a memorial view. And I understand that view is later in history. I understand it. Probably the weakest argument I have is the fact that it's relatively late in history. But when you talk to someone who holds a view, because much of what you would say as far as connecting us to the event, I think that's true. I think there's a reality that when we do this, it is reminding us of this once for all sacrifice that was made. I think that's an important, and our church celebrates the Lord's Supper every Sunday. So it's not like we do it once a year or once a quarter. This is something we do every week to bring to bear the reality that this sacrifice has been made. So what are your thoughts when you look, because you were Presbyterian growing up,
Sure.
Now you're Lutheran, you've never been in a church, I assume, that was a memorialist view. Do you hold that as a heresy view, or do you hold that as more of a heterodox, or just something that you disagree with? How are your thoughts? And I'm not asking you either to affirm me or absolve me. I'm not asking any. I'm just literally curious sometimes how people would see the different perspectives, and for someone who comes from a different perspective on this very central issue of the gospel.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I certainly have been around people with memorialist views. I went my like evangelical youth group I spent a lot of time in when I was younger. They were all memorialists, so it's not like it's something I haven't been around. And I don't really know that in that Presbyterian church, the Lord's Supper was talked about occasionally, and Calvin's view was presented, but I don't think that often. I mean, I think most of those people had a memorialist view. I also tend to think that within Reformed congregations, the majority of people probably hold memorialist views. I think it's rare to find one, and that's not the case. Because personally, I think Calvin's view is just kind of hard to hold, because I think he's kind of holding two views that stand in tension with each other together, or trying to do so. But regarding what I would think about it, I mean, I wouldn't use the term heresy, but I would also say it's very important. I mean, this is the issue that Luther wouldn't unite with Zwingli over. Now,
Yes.
I do think that when Luther didn't shake Zwingli's hand over this particular issue, I think there were broader principles at work behind that too. And so I don't know if it's just one, like, oh, they agreed on everything, but they disagreed on one particular thing. I think there are broader principles that are often revealed within Eucharistic differences. And there, that was revealed in their Christological differences. And your Christological differences have a significant effect on all sorts of things. So I think the kind of particular point they disagreed on that ended up causing the break was over that particular issue, but I think it was more than that. So I wouldn't say that it's heretical, and I'm very careful about using the word heresy. I don't just throw it around to refer to any teaching that I think is false, but certainly I would say it was a heterodox teaching. I mean, we certainly wouldn't. I wouldn't say that somebody who has a memorialist view of the Lord's Supper is not a Christian. I mean, I absolutely wouldn't say that. But at the same time, I wouldn't say that it's mere secondary issue. It's not really that important either. I mean, I think it's pretty essential.
Gotcha. Well, when I'm going to ask you the same question I asked the group of Lutherans who were with me before. And again, this has been over a year ago. It was Hans, it was Tapani, it was several other guys. I don't know if you know all those guys. Good guys. I mean, very, very much cooler than me. Like I say, the Lutherans are the cool kids at the Protestant lunch table. But I asked them, I said, okay, so if I visited a Lutheran church as a Baptist pastor, would I be welcome to participate in communion? And I understand that there are different understandings of like closed and open communion. Like at our church, we will allow people to participate in communion who are not members, so long as they are confessing believers, baptized believers who are members of other churches. So I don't know what your rules are for that, but I would be curious how you see that as far as if someone came in holding a memorialist view, would they be welcome to have communion?
So within Lutheran parishes, pastors handle the issue somewhat differently, though supposedly synods have unanimity on this issue, but in practice it's not. It's not the case. But you do talk about, closed communion versus a more open communion. The most open communion I think you tend to see within confessional Lutheran churches are still like the most open that confessional churches get. So I'm not talking about the ELCA or even maybe some more low church LCMC, maybe kind of congregation churches or Free Lutheran Church, maybe. But the most open they tend to get is to invite anybody who believes in the real presence up to the table. I mean, that's about the most open you're going to see Lutherans get. So it's pretty universal, even across Lutheran bodies, that those who have a memorialist view are not welcome to come to the table. And this is because we understand that when you are gathered together as a church and you are celebrating the sacrament, this is a sacrament that it's not just vertical, it doesn't just have the vertical dimension of us and God, but it's also got this horizontal dimension. And so if you are coming forward in a Lutheran service to receive the sacrament in a context where there's a certain teaching about the sacrament that is believed and confessed and present in the liturgy, I would say that you shouldn't want to take the supper with us, because with your body, you are confessing something. You are confessing that you are uniting with us, that you are united to what we believe is happening here with our faith. I think we tend to just be very individualistic in our culture and just think, well, how come I'm not welcome to do that? And I think that's a misunderstanding, because you're not in the supper just coming forward to get something for yourself, but it's also a confession of the church, of that particular body. So, along with that, there are all sorts of other concerns as well related to how open communion should be on a kind of congregational level, because I think implied within communion is also some kind of authority of that congregation to be able to exercise discipline if necessary, and to know your soul and your spiritual state. So I think that, and that's kind of a neglected element, I think, in much of our talk about these things, but it is something that we should probably take more seriously than we do.
That's interesting, connecting it to the ability of the congregation to enact discipline. That's interesting thought. Certainly something worth considering for sure. Okay, I have had you for almost an hour now, and I have something fun we're going to do at the end, and I don't want to leave that out. But before we get there, and I know this could lead into another hour, so I'm going to say, for your time's sake, I'll be as brief as possible. But I mentioned earlier about the difference between Lutheran and Calvinistic monergism. And for the people who don't know what monergism is, that refers to God being the single worker in salvation. God is the one who opens the heart, applies salvation, and gives the gift of faith. This is God's work, not ours. So when we are saved, we don't present God something from us, but we receive something from him. It's one worker. And maybe I'm being overly simplified in that understanding. You're welcome to correct or expand on that if you would. But would we agree essentially on the idea of monergism? And if so, where are the differences in Lutheran understanding of monergism versus a Reformed Calvinistic understanding of monergism?
Yeah, so I mean, there is agreement on the broad scope of monergism, right? So that we're saying that, yes, there is one worker in conversion, right? So that if you are converted, if you've gone from death to life, your will played no role in that. Your will was the thing that was transformed by grace. And so within that Augustinian general backdrop, I think we're aligned there. The distinction is going to be the question of resistance toward grace, and whether there is a possibility of resisting grace. And what we're talking about, and I know Calvinists have ways of saying we resist grace in some sense, but can we truly resist grace, the grace of conversion, if God truly intends for that to be given to us? So we would distinguish between two ways that God works, right? So sometimes God works according to his absolute power, which means that what he does is not resistible. So, for example, Pharaoh crossing through the Red Sea, he wasn't going to be able to resist God's act of judgment on him. He was gone when he decided that, right? Different from, say, Moses going to Pharaoh repeatedly and telling him to let people go. Well, that call was resistible. So we would say that though God certainly could enact conversion by means of his irresistible power, he chooses not to do that and instead works in a mediated way through the means of grace. And so we would say that God converts by his grace through means, but that grace that he gives through means can be resisted, even to the point of damnation. So here is where Calvinists get annoyed with us because we invoke paradox and say that that not all of the truths of how exactly this works have been revealed to us. And so what we're really trying to do is reckon with sets of biblical texts. So we're reckoning with, on the one hand, texts that seem to talk about a universal grace, universal desire for salvation, universal atonement. Obviously, it would take a lot longer to get into those texts. And then on the other hand, we're looking at this other set of texts that certainly seems to support monergism, that certainly seems to say that those who are redeemed are elected unto faith, that election is not merely God foreseeing some act of the creature. And so the question is, how do we reconcile those two sets of texts? And in a Lutheran perspective, we would say, we feel like the Arminians kind of don't really fully explain in a clear way what those texts actually mean that talk about monergism. So we would say that we think the Calvinists have take those texts kind of at face value, where the Arminians are kind of jumping through hoops to make them make sense. But on the other hand, we would say we feel like the Calvinists are kind of doing the same thing when it comes to the text about universal grace. And so what we do is affirm both monergistic conversion and election. You could even say an unconditional election, though that's not like a term Lutherans tend to use. And we would also then affirm the universality of grace. So we hold those two truths together. I wouldn't say, because some people say that's a contradiction. I would say it's not a contradiction. It's simply a recognition that there are things that God reveals to us that we just don't quite know how they fit together. And that's not because God is contradictory. That's just the limitation of the human intellect, or the limitation of what God has actually revealed. And so if God has revealed those two truths, we hold them together and say, well, they must both be true. So maybe we don't systematically have exactly the precise way to say how it is that they fit together, but we can affirm both of those things.
Yeah, this is where I think it really would, and it would be difficult for me to understand what you mean, and this is just as I hear you talking, the affirmation that the will plays no part because
Yes.
God changes our will, and yet we are able to resist,
Yes.
which seems like an act of the will. And I think this
resistance is an act of the will. Yes. So we don't have any positive capacities of the will in spiritual good, but we have negative capacities to resist.
Okay. It seems like it's almost like when we talk about single versus double predestination, which is often the other argument. And I tend to, I believe, hold to maybe a more moderated position, because I don't tend to like the term double predestination. I like the idea that I believe that God has predestined the elect, but I believe God has passed over the reprobate or the non-elect, and therefore it's not an equal ultimacy view where God does the same thing in his act of grace as he does as his act of reprobation. One is a positive and one is a holding back, and so I would say they are not equally an act of God in the same way. And for the Lutheran, though, when it comes to predestination, is there any sense in which God has determined these things, or is it all the resistance of the will that makes one fit or unfit for the kingdom?
Yeah, so we don't really work within the category of the non-elect. Like, you're not going to hear Lutherans talk about the non-elect.
Okay.
Now,
fair.
In a proper sense, we are going to say the elect are, properly speaking, yes, those who are finally saved. And yes, the elect are those who are elected from eternity unto eternal salvation. So,
and that it's interesting you mentioned that word too, and I don't mean to interrupt you, but I don't want to forget, because you just said finally saved. That's another place that I think there would be a distinction, because you believe a person can be genuinely justified, forensically declared righteous before God, and at some point forfeit that justification through rejecting Christ and anathematizing from the faith. This is correct?
Yes.
Am I?
Yes. Yeah. So that's another element of this. And so we don't precisely identify the regenerate with the elect. Like there are some of those who fall away from the faith and will ultimately not be finally saved, even though they had saving faith at some point. And this is Augustine's view as well. So this certainly is within the Augustinian tradition. And I mean, this is a reality that everybody has to reckon with. That there are people who certainly appear to be regenerate, genuine Christians who fall away. We all have to deal with that in one way or another. And so, yes, we would respond to that by saying that in light of the biblical descriptions of some of those who fall away, we would say that those biblical descriptions certainly seem to fit like genuine Christians better than they do just hypocrites.
Yeah, and this is one of those. I mean, obviously, I'm a Calvinist, and I affirm the 5 points of Calvinism. This is one of those times, though, where I would say perseverance of the saints fits almost more of what you're saying is weird. A person, if they fall away, the difference between us would be the question of whether or not they ever were truly recipients of regeneration. Right? You would say a person can be regenerate and then not.
Yes, correct.
Where a Calvinist would say a person who falls away was never regenerate. And I understand I understand why that would be a problem on either side. Like there's a question of, well, if a person is genuinely regenerate, how can they lose that? I mean, that's the question that the Calvinist asks. But the question for the Lutheran often is, well, if a person is regenerate, if they were never regenerate, how could they have done the things that seem to be in a keeping with a regenerate nature, right?
Exactly.
Believing
Yes.
and participating in
Yes.
these things. So, and at the end of the day, we both say that there's a genuine apostasy that can happen. It's just
Right.
what has happened prior to that. So I think
Yeah.
it's funny that we agree on so much, and yet we come back and we say, but there's this sort of big deal that we
Yes.
disagree on, and
Yeah.
that's the question of whether or not they were ever regenerated. And
Yeah, and that gets back to our view of resistible grace. So we would say that even in a state of regeneration, it's possible to, though we credit God completely with one's perseverance in the faith, we would say that there is still the possibility for the human being to resist God, even to the point of damnation.
yeah, you guys love to swim in the waters of mystery, don't you?
Yeah, we do. And I know maybe that's frustrating for some people, but
And I did not mean, if that sounded insulting. I hope it didn't. I was just saying, you guys, there are tensions. I think we often talk about, we talk about in our church sometimes that if you stretch a rubber band, the tension is not here or here. The tension is in the middle, right? It's that point where that's the point where all the tension is held, is right in the middle, not on the ends. And this is often where we talk about things like election and predestination and free will. There's a tension, but it's in the middle. You guys tend to be much more comfortable with that tension.
Yes. Yeah, we definitely are. And I find it freeing to be able to embrace mystery. I think that there is some freedom in being able to say, well, if God has revealed these two truths, it's okay if I don't know how to put them together. And I think that's a hard thing to do. Initially, I know I had a really hard time with that, but at this point in my life, I don't know. I feel like the older you get, the more mysterious the world seems, and the more, I don't know, apparent my own intellectual limitations are.
Well, Dr. Cooper, I want to just, before we get to this final thing we're going to do, which is just something I call sanctified shenanigans, which is just a few fun questions to finish everything up. I just want to say how much I've enjoyed this conversation, your willingness to answer my questions, and hopefully be a blessing to the audience by hearing this. So I just want to thank you for your time and for you giving yourself to us for this last hour. It's been a blessing.
Yeah, it was fun. Well, thank you.
So here are my 5 sanctified shenanigan questions, and I'm actually going to I'm going to add one little one to the end, but so it'll be 6, but they'll be quick, and this will be what closes us out for this hour. Number 1, when I first saw you, I told you on X that I thought you looked like Macaulay Culkin with a beard. That was not an insult. I just genuinely think you look like Macaulay Culkin with a beard. So, which is better, Home Alone 1 or Home Alone 2?
I get this a lot, actually, in my comments, and I've never had anyone in real life tell me I look like Macaulay Culkin, but I hear it a lot in my YouTube comments. To be honest with you, I have not watched Home Alone 1 or 2 since I was a kid. And I know maybe that's a terrible thing to say. I'm sorry. So
we watch them every Christmas. Our kids love it. Yeah.
See, our go-to dumb Christmas movie is Jingle All the Way, which is like a really terrible movie, but it's our go-to. It's got little Anakin Skywalker. So
it's Turbo Man. Absolutely. Arnold Schwarzenegger and Anakin Skywalker. It's great. Yeah, absolutely. And you've got the creepy, Phil Hartman, the creepy neighbor who's the wife. That part of the story is always so awkward.
He's good at playing a creepy guy.
He is. And just for the record, the correct answer is Home Alone 1 is the better film, but Home Alone 2 is more fun to watch. So that's the correct answer.
Yeah, well, that's what I meant to say.
Yeah. Okay, number 2, what's a completely useless talent that you possess that you're strangely proud of?
Well, the thing that a lot of people know me for is my yo-yo skills. So
oh, wow.
Are you aware of this? I have a yo-yo right here, actually.
I have no. Please show me.
So you can look up videos. I don't know if I could do it here with the camera here, but I at one time I did competitions all throughout the country. I competed at the World Yo-Yo Contest back in 2001. I was the Mid-Atlantic regional champion, even though I didn't live in the Mid-Atlantic. Yeah.
Well, that's incredible. I had no idea. That's really cool. Well, that's And I get excited about stuff like that because in high school I was a professional magician. I did parties as a magician.
Nice.
So like when I hear those types of skills, I'm like, that's fun. I'd love to watch you
yeah.
do. I'd love to watch you do that. That's so much fun. All right. This one might not be as fun, but I'd love to hear your answers to this one. What's a theological hot take that would get you in hot water and maybe even get you disinvited from future conferences? What's a theological hot take?
There are things I keep to myself, to be honest with you at times. But I don't know. Let's see. Let me give you, well, maybe I'll just give you one here. And that is, I think some of the arguments for paedo communion are pretty compelling. I do. That doesn't mean that I'm like ready to start communing infants, but I think that moving toward a younger communion practice, would probably, I don't know, be a beneficial thing. I really, that's an issue that I really wrestle with a lot. But, don't talk about a lot.
How old are children in the Lutheran Church usually when they are confirmed and receive communion?
Yeah, usually it's like the end of middle school because it's after confirmation. Okay. And to me, that's very old. I just,
gotcha.
Yeah, that there's a lot I think about that issue, but you know, I have a hard time with kids being raised in the church who are able to say, I want Jesus, and then saying no to them. And I feel like we do that. And it's almost as if we're communicating to them that they're excommunicated or they're not in Christ in the same way that others are. Why I struggle with this, and I know I'm probably going to get myself in trouble for saying this on here, and that's not quite paedo communion either. That's younger communion. I'm not compelled totally by paedo communion, but.
Well, the good thing is this is at the last part of an hour-long show,
yeah,
so
nobody's
only the truly dedicated, only the truly dedicated will hear of your position. Okay, one book outside of Scripture that has changed your life.
Oh boy. Okay, maybe this is a very silly answer, but I will tell you. Heir to the Empire by Timothy Zahn. It's a Star Wars novel.
Wow. I love you so much. I have no idea. That's amazing.
And the reason is just because Star Wars books as a kid got me to love books. And like, maybe it sounds silly, but that just got me to love the idea of reading. And when I was a kid, my dad he did a lot of business trips. So he was gone a lot and wanted to stay in touch as much as he could while he was gone. So he used to buy me a Star Wars book and give it to me. And then he'd read the same book while he was on the trip we could talk about. So I've got a lot of memories with that. But that really actually got me to love books. And so maybe you could say that Star Wars books are the things that led me to study theology in some roundabout way.
What a great family memory too.
Yeah,
wow,
it is.
That's a blessing. All right. If you could travel back in time and tell yourself something while you were in high school, and it can't be like this is one I always say you can't do. You can't say like buy Tesla. That's too easy, right? But if you could travel back in time and tell yourself something when you were in high school, what would you say?
Yeah. I mean, I think, I don't know. I might just say, don't take any of these girls too seriously. I worried way too much about girls when I was in high school. And
testify. Even though I married my high school sweetheart, though. So.
Oh, you did? Okay, so it worked out for you. But it felt like death or life kind of stuff, at that age, and it's not. Yeah.
How old were you when you met your wife?
It was my senior year of college, and she was young. She was a freshman, so she was 18, and I was 21. So we got married. I was 23 and she was 20. So it was pretty quick.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, tell her I said thank you for helping me with the emails back and forth. I appreciate that. All right. Last thing, and we'll close. We talked about this before we started recording. I always say that Reformed Baptists love Presbyterians, often more than Presbyterians love their Reformed Baptists. And Presbyterians tend to love Lutherans more than Lutherans love them back. So you had something to add to that, and I think it'd be a fun way to close out.
Oh yeah. No, I've had people say this before, and I say Lutherans do this with Rome all the time. right? We do this with Roman Catholics. We for whatever reason, we're like, we want you to consider our holy orders valid or something. So we want to be recognized by Rome. And then I said, Rome really wants to be recognized by the East, and the East just doesn't care and hates everybody.
That's my
So
Baptists love Presbyterians, Presbyterians love Lutherans, Lutherans love Catholics, Catholics love Eastern Orthodox, and Eastern Orthodox hate everyone. I think I'm going to make that into a poster because that's awesome.
Yeah.
All right, my friend. Well, again, I'm so grateful to have you on the show. Hopefully, maybe one day we could do this again. And if there's ever anything I can do for you, please let me know. But let our audience know what's the best way to get a hold of you if they're interested in watching your videos or checking out what you're doing over at Justin Center.
Yeah, sure. You can go to justincenter.org, and and that's the theological organization that I run. It's not just me, but we do a lot of things, publishing and YouTube and podcasts and a number of other things as well. So if you want to find all that I'm doing, you can check everything out on the website.
All right, guys. Well, again, I want to thank you for watching today's episode. I hope this was a blessing to you. And remember, the best thing you can do for us to help support the show is, number one, subscribe to the channel. And if you like this particular video, hit the thumbs up button. And if you didn't, hit the thumbs down button twice. All right, guys. Thank you for watching Your Calvinist Podcast. My name is Keith Foskey, and I've been your Calvinist. May God bless you.
Hi, my name's Justin Johnson.
And I'm Josiah Stowe.
And we are Dominion Wealth Strategists. We are created to put money in the hands of those that are sitting in the pews.
From budgeting to estate planning, savings accounts, retirement planning, life insurance, and a heck of a lot more here at Dominion.
That means that you are leaving an inheritance that passes multiple generations because that is the legacy. It's part of our mission.
All of Christ for all of life.
And all of finance for Christendom.